you know, prefrontal cortex, this isn't real. But your body and your brain, the way that it works, it is real, which is the same as accessing your past, right?
Right. Our brain does not know the difference. So if we're feeling the feelings and we're doing the things, that's what gets wired in. So we need to go back and we need to access the way that those things were stored in our minds, in our body, and we need to change it. Welcome back to the Mind Change Podcast. I'm your host, Heather McKean, and joining us today is co-founder of the Mind Change Method, Kent McKean.
Hi, thanks for having me back.
Glad to have you. A quick moment out there for all of you watching and listening. Please take this opportunity to subscribe, like, download. You can subscribe to the podcast on all of the major platforms. Also, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel. Follow us on social at Mind Change, and all those things that help us to continue to create free content for you and for others. All right. Welcome back.
Thanks.
Okay, so today we are talking about one of the basic tenets of the Mind Change Method.
Yes.
And that is the victim versus victor mindset.
All right. So let's get into it. So why don't you start off? Maybe you could define what is a victim mindset and then what is a victor mindset and maybe some of the differences.
Yeah, so I think it's really important not to miss the word mindset in this, rather than just us saying, I'm a victim or I'm a victor, right? Like these different things, because it's really the mindset that we're getting into, how we have our mind set. That's the thing that's going to really dictate what we get more of.
Right.
So this was really profound for me in the beginning of my journey, because I really did feel like a victim. In fact, I was reinforced that I was a victim. I was a victim of, let's say, neglect, which I really didn't realize or think about until later. I was a victim of physical abuse, victim of sexual abuse, right? These things. Now, I do not want to belittle that or mock that in any way, because at the time, as a child, I was a victim of these things.
So just for a second, for our audience, can you explain the difference of this idea of a victim mindset versus being a victim of these things? That would be really helpful.
Right. So it's very real to be a victim of something, to be perpetrated against.
Right.
And a quote that I use in the book that I think is very important for us to at least just have an awareness of, at least just, if you're not ready to dive in fully yet, just have some awareness of being a victim is never our fault. Staying a victim is our responsibility. So if we're staying a victim, that's our responsibility. We are staying within that victimization. So being victimized, never our fault. Staying a victim would be.
So explain this idea of staying a victim, our responsibility. I mean, obviously we don't want to stay a victim, I would think.
Right.
But how is it our responsibility? How do we get out of the victimhood?
So being a child, I think what we have to understand is that the mindset is something we all naturally come into the world with. If we're taking the victim mindset, really it's about where the power lies. And so we have an illustration that we use in the book, the circle with a little baby in it. And a child or a baby has no real agency at that point. Their entire life, survival, is dependent on another person. So it's really a dependent-driven model of thinking of life, and it's the only one they have. It's the only option.
Right.
No baby can be like, you know what? I don't need my parents. I'm just gonna, no, they would die, clearly. So what ends up happening is we when we have this model as a child and into our adolescence, oftentimes what it is that we have failed to get the skills or the examples to mature into what we would say, really, if we're using these two terminologies, the victor mindset, which is really just a shift of the power.
Okay, so just for a second, this idea of mindset, dependency, and power, these are very, very important with this whole construct, right? So maybe kind of break down for us the idea of why each of these things are important and how people can understand each of them.
Right. So if I say a dependent model of thinking, right, that's where a child needs to be fed, needs to be given food.
Okay.
Needs to, if we're talking about a baby, they need to be changed, right? They soil themselves. They don't have the agency to do anything about that.
So they need someone
They
else.
really need someone. They are, by every definition, dependent upon another human being.
Right. And as they mature, what would happen or what would need to happen?
Right. So in an ideal world, we are maturing in a safe, loving place where we have expectations, known consequences. That's a learning environment. And a child has the ability to safely learn within that construct that over time they will start to have more agency, more sovereignty over their being.
In other words, they're going to, instead of that power needing to be given to them constantly, they start to develop that internal power, that ability, that capability.
Right. Another word, autonomy. Right. That autonomy that, oh, I'm actually responsible for the way I feel, for what happens to me to some degree. Those are the things that we begin to learn in childhood. I think that it's important to understand that trauma makes this whole maturation process messy, and we get some maladaptive qualities. And remember, the definition of trauma that we like to use, attributed to Gabor Mate, is trauma is anything that overwhelms the body's ability to cope. That covers lots of bases when we talk about trauma. So when we institute trauma, what happens is it sort of muddies the waters in our autonomy or in our safety. And that really gets wired in. So if a child is victimized, abused, that can be physically, verbally, mentally abused, even being bullied, is something that the child realizes that a person outside of them has the ability to make them feel something inside of them. Okay. So children, that is going to happen. Ideally, they're in a safe environment. They have safe primary caregivers. They have regulated primary caregivers who are able to hold that space and just, explain that to the child and say, hey, it's right that you feel these things, and of course you're hurt and everything, but understanding that those are things produced in the child.
So it's interesting you're bringing all this up, because this ideal world, right, which all of us are living in, no, all of us were raised in this like perfect, safe environment. No, but because I would say the majority of people have not been raised that way, it makes me wonder and maybe recognize why so many people today as 30, 40, 50, 60-year-olds need that kind of continual validation, continual maybe empathy from someone else, because maybe they never got it. And so they're in this state of still feeling like a victim because they were never able to be validated in that, and then remaining in that mindset.
Right. Well, they stay within that, the victimized mindset or the dependent model of thinking, which is I'm unhappy because.
Gotcha.
I'm broke because. I'm, my body looks the way it does because. And it's this constant, the reason I am the way I am is point the finger out, take your pick on what thing you want to blame for your condition.
Now, as a baby, my diaper's wet because someone hasn't changed it yet, right? I mean, there's
Well, really, I mean, the diaper's wet because the baby soiled itself.
sure,
For it to be clean, it doesn't have any other ability.
right. But as an adult,
If we're sitting in a dirty diaper, at that point, it's really us. Now listen, if we've got the agency, we're not talking about a paraplegic here or anything like that. Everyone always loves to find the way this isn't really true.
sure.
But for all intents and purposes, if we talk about just sort of normalized society, that is within our ability to change. So often, so I'll just take this real personal. It's always better to do that, right? I found myself in my 20s and early 30s feeling very much like a victim. I would have said that, my depression at the time that I was doing, all the chronic illnesses that I was doing, my relationship with money, like so many things, anything that was negative in my life, I could quickly and easily point a finger to why I was the way I was.
Now, really quick, this idea of your 20s and 30s, like easily being in the victim mindset, you would not have, and correct me if I'm wrong, you wouldn't have said, I'm just really playing the victim. These are just things,
I'd have
right?
probably punched you in the nose.
But what is it, like, how would someone be able to identify, and I think you were getting there, but how would someone be able to identify what mindset they're in?
Yeah, it's that difference between mindset and experience that has happened to me.
Okay.
So was it true that, there were things that had happened to me? Yes. Was I a victim of things? Yes. So we are not trying to villainize the word victim. So we've got this relationship with the word victim being, it's really triggery for a lot of people. Rightly so in some ways, because for a good long while, and I think it of course still happens, there was victim shaming.
Well, yeah, and the terminology, trauma and victim, have become so, I mean, it's everywhere, right? It's very, very, it's just in our modern day society talk.
Right. Yeah, and also I think it bypassed people, it invalidated people's experiences for quite a long time when it was said to them, like, don't be such a victim. When they had never had the ability to think through in what ways they were victimized and have that validated. And I think that the mindset, which is really what we're after here, gets put in when they continue to need that validation. When it's so important for someone to know, for me, that I was physically abused as a child or neglected as a child, because it explains my behavior today, right? That was kind of you would understand, you would be easier on me, you would have more compassion for me, more empathy for me if you knew my history.
So it's people that are wanting validation of sorts.
Right. So is me wanting validation and having my needs met. Now you see, remember back, I have a history of neglect. So part of wanting to get my needs met was this thing of being seen, being known, people being curious about me, right? That's not what happened as a child. So as an adult, I'm still seeking that.
So your experience was not being seen, heard, understood. And because it was never fulfilled, you ended up perceiving everything in the future being not heard, not understood, not, even though maybe people were really interested, but because you kept this trauma, these problems from childhood, it kind of continued into your 20s and 30s.
Right. They never had a chance to be fully resolved in the sense that for me, I had gone back and seen, heard, witnessed those things for myself, and then rewired them in my brain so that I don't have to be neglected to be worthy of attention. You see, that's what it ends up saying, is in my adulthood, well, the reason that you should pay attention to me, the reason you should have compassion for me or empathy for me is because of my history, where I came from. And in one sense, that's invalidating me. That's me invalidating me.
You already feel powerless, and now you're looking for someone else to continue to give you power instead of having it from within.
Yeah, and it's not really, is that really me having power? That's a semblance
Sure.
of power, and it's not real. And I will have to keep being a victim of something to keep getting what I perceive to be compassion, attention, whatever it is. So do we need compassion? Yes. Do we need attention? Absolutely. Do we need connection? And yes. But what I started to shift into was I don't want attention and compassion and empathy because I'm a victim of blah, blah, blah. I actually should have gotten that from the beginning.
Right.
I was worthy of that in the beginning. There was actually nothing wrong with me. There was something wrong with the environment. Okay? I have a choice to be a product of my environment or to start to take the power back and say, I'm responsible for my feelings about this, the way I conduct myself, who I am. Because even though there was neglect in my childhood, I was never meant to be neglected. I was worthy of all love and all attention and all the good things. So that's what I would rather hold now. That's that victor mindset. If we move into that, I am victorious over what? The world. No, me.
Okay.
My feelings, my thinking, my past.
Now, there's a lot of people that are hearing this and they're like, okay, I identify with that. I get that I didn't get what I needed as a child and I'm still holding on to those things today and it's still manifesting in different ways, right? I think there's an understanding there. Maybe you could explain a little bit about that transition, because it's easy to say, get a different mindset, right? I mean, there's so many things out there.
It's easy to say it.
Right, it's easy to say it. Just like, oh, well, change your mindset in this. And there's so many mindset coaching and mindset. There's so many things out there, but there is a difference between actually having a victim mindset and then moving from that into a victor mindset. Maybe you could explain a little bit of like, how do you get from one to the other? How do you reconcile all the things that maybe have happened to you as a child or as a young adult or whatever into this power?
Such a great question. Because many people try to do it that way that you just explained. I will positively affirm my way into believing I am worthy of love. I'm going to say it and I'm going to write it and I'm going to journal it and I'm going to stick it on my mirror. And all of those things can be wonderful tools. But what we have to understand is our conscious mind goes off of our belief system built by our subconscious mind. And our subconscious mind is what drives our thoughts, feelings, behaviors, experiences, filters, right? 95% and probably more. So our subconscious mind uses our history, our past, to build our belief systems. So all day long, I can look at my mirror and say that I am worthy of love. But if every time I say that, my subconscious mind will answer that and go, really? Because boop, 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 boop. And it'll start feeding
Firing
me
up all those
memories and experiences that are contrary. Why? Because my mind hates me. Not at all. My mind loves me. And it is incongruent. And we're not trying to be in a split mind. Right? That does happen. That's a full-on diagnosis. It's when the subconscious mind has so much stuff that the conscious mind cannot stay. Like, you have to exit reality in your mind.
Absolutely. I mean, I grew up in a great family, right? Very positively affirming, very all those things. And yet my subconscious somehow held on to a belief, something I heard, something I felt, something whatever, when I was younger, so much about my worthiness and not being enough unless, right? Like a performance-based worth almost. Mm-hmm. And yet, I mean, I had all of these different talents as a teenager and in my 20s and all these different things and great things I got to be a part of, whether that's commercials and, movie sets and, music and all this other stuff. And then marrying you and like all the ways that you positively affirmed and you're, all these different things. And yet what was still trucking along inside my brain was this idea of, yeah, but right? This like, well, I guess people are saying this, or I guess this is what's perceived, but I know blah, blah, blah. And it was a lack of worthiness, a lack of power, a lack of myself.
Right. If you have to perform to earn love and you have all of these wonderful things brought into your life, you have a wife and you have children, or you have all these friends, or you have this job or these responsibilities. If you have a performance-based love, now you have a heck of a lot more people to perform for. And it actually becomes heavier. So through the lens of I need to perform for love, now you're looking at like, oh, I have so many performances to keep track of every day. And it usually brings people down. Usually from the outside looking in, those people will say they have everything. They have everything. Why did they sabotage? Or maybe we don't know that they sabotaged, but they typically do sabotage.
Oh, it's interesting because everything that I put my effort into had to do really with a background of performing, right? And again, whether that's acting or whatever else, but even just public speaking or working with people, or I mean, all of these things, this isn't behind the scenes stuff. I wasn't sitting on my computer doing admin stuff. I mean, this is like in front of people all the time, needing to show up. And so, yeah, I mean, there's my output.
Yes. And it's an interesting component behind chronic illness. Oftentimes we find in chronic illness, one of the secondary gains, which we've talked about secondary gains before, is that someone will take care of them because someone has to take care of them, right? But to make themselves feel better as an adult, rather than, well, I'm being taken care of in some of these ways, almost like a child, because I can't do these things for myself, which means the people in your life have to. That's the mindset, which makes it okay. So that's where the chronic illness really serves somebody. But that is that victimized mindset that I am not worthy of being taken care of, or I won't be taken care of, or it's not going to happen unless. And oftentimes these are subconscious. Nobody that I know who's chronically ill thought that consciously. These are subconscious programs. And that's why the victim-victor are very strong sort of subcategories of programs that we can fall into. So one of the common things that we get, if people get a little bit resistant to this framework, is, yeah, but bad things happen. Like really bad things happen. And yes, they do. They absolutely do. And so we are never saying that victimization doesn't happen. Unfortunately, especially in our work, we hear just infinite amounts of victimization, of perpetration, right?
So bad things happening to people.
Yes.
Period.
But what people sometimes don't understand about the way the brain works. So for instance, we in the book, we talk a lot about the reticular activating system. It's a bundle of nerves sort of at the base of our skull here that acts as like a tractor, a filter, a director of what's important to us. It's what decides what comes in and what gets sort of perceived as not important. And the reticular activating system, if we see ourselves as a victimized person, if we feel perpetrated against, that little bundle of nerves begins to look for danger all over the place.
So if you're someone who, feels like a victim in some way or whatever, feels like bad things happen, if you...
Or not even feels like, let's just say actually some bad thing happened.
Okay, so let's say something happened or a number of things happened or a bunch of stuff happened. Then as they continue to age, as time goes on, even if 10 people bring them gifts of some sort, they're going to remember the one who doesn't. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, or even to take it into a more extreme example, you can look at people who have been victims of like a sexual attack or a sexual trauma. The odds of them being victimized again are astronomically higher.
Right. I mean, this is just research.
This is just research.
Yep.
One or maybe even multiple more times in their life. How do you explain that? How is that explained? Well, I feel like it can be explained if we look at the brain hardware and we look at the reticular activating system. As a way for that person to protect themselves, they are now even more highly attuned to danger, which makes them a little bit more, a little bit more like this, right? If you talk to perpetrators and you ask them to profile a victim, who they look for, they are looking for the more frightened looking individual, the one that looks easier to overtake, maybe the one that hangs back, maybe the one that's a little bit more, that looks frightened, because they seem easier from a prey standpoint. Like if we really take this back into the primal way of predator versus prey, they want predators look for the weaker individual.
Yeah, they're not going to go after the ones who are strong and they're going to have to work hard at.
Right. Now, does that mean that the person who was sexually attacked is weaker? No. But what happens is, because the fear is real and the body is doing everything it can to ensure this doesn't happen again, it's on the lookout for it. And that hypervigilance and that hyper awareness creates a perceived way of being, an energy, a more reserved, frightened, scared, victimized energy.
Right. So we've talked about the victim mindset. We've talked about, this dependent driven, powerless kind of person or mindset, at least. Explain a little bit, and you started to talking about your story, your 20s and 30s. Explain a little bit this transition of moving from victimhood, not being a victim, because victim things, people are affected and things happen, which creates the victim, right? There are perpetrations. There's that. But then how do we move out of something bad happening to someone constantly feeling like bad things always happen to me?
Right. Yes, that's circling us back to that thing where you can't take a conscious approach to a subconscious program.
Right.
I think a really great example of this is in our course, we show this video, but there's this concept of something called TRE, and it's the idea that trauma can get stuck somatically in our body, and that if it's stuck, it causes major issues within our physical body. And we see that in animals play out. And an example, we show a video of a gazelle that had been attacked by a lioness. And then these hyenas come, I think, to try to claim the prey, and they attack the lioness. And then we focus in on the gazelle, and the gazelle first, the affect of the gazelle's glazed eyes, paralyzation, she isn't actually mortally wounded, but she has been attacked, and
There's
her life
been trauma.
Yes, this is very much a trauma experience. And we get to focus on the gazelle and what happens, and she goes through a few stages. The first stage is just this, you sort of see life come back into her eyes a little bit. She comes back up, and then she does this incredible full body convulsion shaking. And the shaking is an animal's way of processing out the trauma that happened to their body. And what science has shown is if at this point during the shaking, the hyenas were to have gotten her, she's done. She cannot get up. She couldn't have run. She couldn't have defended herself until that trauma was processed out of her body. Luckily for this gazelle that we show, she does get to finish the process. And after she shakes, you can see it slowly stops, and she's able to get up on her feet, and then she can escape.
And so instead of remaining in that trauma-filled, oh no, they're after me, like, what do I do? Let me go hide. She's actually able to process through it and then run off and be her normal, happy self.
Right. And not actually, then we don't see, if you follow these animals in the wild, we don't see them being hyper, paralyzed by fear moving forward. In fact, they probably become a little more sprightly. They probably become a little bit more in tune with how powerful their body is, and they are less likely to be the victim of that attack again.
Okay, so humans.
Yes. So doesn't really we do this too, actually. I remember a very particular trauma in my life where after it was done, about 20 minutes later, this happened to me. I shook uncontrollably. And actually this happened after my C-section. I shook so uncontrollably for, I'd say, maybe an hour. And so it does happen to us, but it's not like we're told this and we don't know what's happening. And oftentimes people try to get you to stop shaking, right? So that, and for us too, because we have a prefrontal cortex and memory gets stored in our brain a little bit more, doesn't mean that this stuff isn't still in our bodies, and we do need to address both. How do we get out of a victim mindset? We have to process the trauma. It has to be rewired in our brain, and it has to be addressed if it's being held in our body.
Okay, so the big question, how do we process it?
Right. Well, I think so my experience was, remember I said that, coming from this history, how do I move forward? Do I just then pretend denial is our society's answer to this, or drugs or alcohol or coping mechanisms, right? That's what we try to do to cope around it. We either pretend it doesn't happen, which hasn't worked, which is why I think we're a little bit more like, I'm a victim, because we realize denial doesn't actually work. Coping mechanisms work for a short amount of time, but it always finds a way back out. Okay? So what I had to do, and this is the genesis of the mind change method, right, was I can't just pretend I'm victorious. I just can't pretend that I'm a victor. I actually have to go back and see it, feel it, touch it, taste it, do it back there in my memories.
Because you didn't process it like the gazelle right away,
right?
You actually have to go back.
Yeah, I have to go back.
Access those neural pathways, access those synapses, access everything that was happening inside of you, what you saw, felt, heard.
Right, and then you will always get but that's not real. Yes, it is real. It's real because when we replay something in our mind, our body does not differentiate between real now and real then.
Which is why people can watch a scary movie and get afraid, or go to a haunted house. Prefrontal cortex, why this isn't real, but your body and your brain, the way that it works, it is real, which is the same as accessing your past, right?
Right. Our brain does not know the difference. So if we're feeling the feelings and we're doing the things, that's what gets wired in. So we need to go back and we need to access the way that those things were stored in our minds, in our body, and we need to change it. That way, when I go to say like, oh, I'm a victor, it's real. I have proof. I have somatic proof. I have visual proof. I have auditory proof. I have kinesthetic proof that actually happened. I was able to have agency then, which when it happened originally, I didn't, but I do now. And I know what that feels like. It gives me experience. It gives me history with it. And then it becomes real now. It becomes a skill. So it's not me just trying to say, I'm victorious, when I have all this real life, stuff that had happened. So as I worked on those things and changed those things, I started to see new things showing up in my real life, like in the now life, right? The present. So because so much of our brain is like that computer that we've talked about, where what's programmed in just comes out, right? You program the programming and then that's what spits out. So you program in that you want this app to pop up when you open your phone and boop, the app pops up.
But when you reprogram your mind, for instance, these things in the past, when you rewire them, all of a sudden different things are popping up, right? Mm-hmm. So it's that RAS still at work. Instead of finding all the ways that you're going to continue to be a victim, your brain starts to find ways how you are empowered, how you are victorious.
Right. So somebody that I love and have quoted numerous times is Viktor Frankl. So for people who may not know Viktor Frankl, one of his famous books is Man's Search for Meaning. So Viktor Frankl was, so for those of you who are like, that's all nice and good, you maybe never really had any bad thing happen. Okay. That's actually not probably true for me, but let's just take my side away and say, yeah, but real horrible things have happened to societies, to generations, to everything. Yes, and this is a great example. Viktor Frankl was a Holocaust survivor. He was in a concentration camp and obviously saw horrific things.
Yep.
But what he learned there, what he learned young and learned there, changed his entire experience, not only in the concentration camp, but for the rest of his life. And one of his famous quotes that he says is, "Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way." And I think, you may be able to hear me talk or you talk or whatever, and you might make assumptions about us and our life and our history. I don't think anyone can take away his experience. It's well documented. We know, we understand that is horrific by anybody's definition. And yet he credits the trajectory of his life and even his survival, interestingly enough, his actual survival in those circumstances, by being able to choose the way he perceived it, by dealing with it then, changing it then. I know, read that book. It's great. You get to see the way that he in the moment was reframing his experiences. Processing in real time. And that led him to a very, very different life outcome than many of his peers, I think, at the time, right? And so, yes, I never want to say or belittle the horrific things that happen to people and in our society and in our world.
But I think what we're trying to say is those don't have to be the things that define you, right? These don't have to be the things that make you a strong person. These don't have to be the things that make you who you are. In fact, when we shift, who we are is already there. It's already powerful, which with the time we have left, I would love for you to be able to share a little bit about this idea, because you're talking about Viktor Frankl, you're talking about how all the things that he went through back then. And of course, we live in societies where thousands and thousands of years of oppression, documented oppression of societies, right? This isn't just like, oh, probably a long time ago there was. We, in the last number of hundreds of years, so much oppression, so much prejudice, so much, whether that's, race or sexism or whatever, there's so many things out there, right? But how does all of this victim, victor, all of that, how does it relate to, I guess, what I would call generational or ancestral oppression, trauma, victimhood? Because obviously there's things that happened thousands of years ago to all of our extended families or whatever. Who knows who that was that long ago, right? But so many people have parents, grandparents, or even, number of generations back, ancestors who had a lot of terrible, terrible things happen, or even just someone's parent. Suicide or abuse or whatever. And yet somehow we're seeing things being passed down, almost like these mentalities or feelings or beliefs passed down generationally. What do we do with that?
That's probably a whole other episode that we will call Epigenetics. But epigenetics is the science of trauma being passed down through our genes. So I know we have a romance with this a little bit culturally, of that if we don't feel it as badly or worse than maybe who it happened to, that we're somehow forgetting it and not honoring it. And so my guess would be, I'm just making a guess here, but sort of not, because I feel like I've actually been witness to some of these beautiful moments where we're able to interact back again with ancestors and everything. It's a whole thing where if those people were to come back and sit with their probably third, fourth generation great great grandchild, and they were to say, I can't believe you are still dealing with this. I don't want you to deal with this. I didn't want to deal with it. I don't want you to be dealing with this. Let it go. Let it go. It was bad enough I had to go through it. I don't want this passed down. I almost guarantee. Now, some people will do something different and have their ancestors come back and be like, keep fighting the fight, right? Or whatever. But what it does to our body, what it does to our brain, no way would someone lovingly say they want their children, grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren to keep carrying the trauma. So this is really important. We can let go of the trauma, but keep the wisdom.
Right.
That's the thing that people think, like, if I let it go, I'm just going to let it happen again to me. It's actually the other way around. If you don't let it go, you're going to keep seeing this in your life. And you will, because of the fact that trauma gets wired into our system, likely pass that down to the first generation, if not the second generation. And we'll get into this in a whole other episode, but interestingly, the study of epigenetics most strongly came from studying Holocaust survivors.
Right.
And seeing the trauma passed down, seeing physical manifestations of, as if the second generation grandchild had been in the concentration camp themselves.
And yet this is decades later.
Yeah, we're seeing malnutrition, we're seeing PTSD in these generations that didn't have that. My guess is it was, the way I feel about it is bad enough it happened the first time. Heck no, you let this keep going on. No, do not let them keep doing this to us.
Well, and how many clients have, we had where we're dealing with ancestral things, right? We're dealing with trauma and really terrible things happening, right? This whole idea of they were victims of something terrible. And then working through it, and instead of, and this is across the board, instead of the client coming with like, well, this happened to my grandfather, or this, it comes and it changes, obviously through the work, through the session and everything. But instead of holding them in that space of sadness, trauma, problems, hardship, the clients now hold their grandparents, their great grandparents in this place of freedom and power, and look what they've passed down to me in a good way, because that is there.
Yeah, I can sort of imagine, even in my lineage, going down being like, are you serious? That's all you took from all the work we did? Like, that you're still passing this stuff down? Like, no, don't miss the good. And that is one of the things. I had a really negative look at my lineage, because what I was seeing was the alcoholism, the physical abuse, the sexual abuse. Like, you can go back many generations and see that this stuff was there, was present.
And then you miss out on...
I miss out on so many wonderful things. I really feel like, and have done this, as woo-woo as this sounds, people, I know it took me a while to get there too, but I've sat with these people, my ancestors, in a space in my head, and watch initially their heartbreak that this stuff was still happening, and so excited to see a cycle breaker, to see someone coming in and saying, no, I'm no longer going to be a victim of this. This stops here. This stops with me. And to some degree, it did, because you'll remember from my story, one of the things that was really a big moment for me was, of course, I have a history of neglect. Now, we could say that was because of alcoholism and drug addiction and everything like that in my home. So I said, I will never use. I will never become an addict, because I will never neglect my children the way I was neglected. Right? See the motivation there? And yet, here I am in my young 30s, so chronically ill that I'm about to die and leave my children without a mother. And now I have a history of a few years from the time they were born till this point where I was so sick and so disabled that I wasn't able to give them all that I would have wanted to give them.
Because you could only give what you were holding within, right? Which was abandonment and neglect and all of that. So that's what you can give in whatever form or fashion that's going to come out.
So that's what I was passing down.
Until
I changed, until I changed my brain and then changed my body and started to have different experiences and understand like, oh wait, I have power here. I have agency. I decide who I am. I decide what I think, how I act, what motivates me. I have the power. And then everything shifted and I started to be able to give those things to my children you can only give what you have. So that means I had to go back and find those things and get those things and have those things wired in so that when I wanted to give, I wasn't coming up empty or I wasn't coming up with trauma wrapped in, the red bow. I actually had the things to give. And so
part of your like going back and even giving your ancestors and your grandparents, giving them what they needed has also helped you. And I think that in our Western world, we're so individualistic and we do focus on the trauma and the things that are passed down that are not good so often. Whereas there actually are so many societies out there that do celebrate their ancestors, that remember the dead for the good things, for all, like there are even, goodness, this idea of sitting with your ancestors, how many native tribes or, do that. And yet we don't. We hold on to the trauma for some reason, right?
Yeah, well, because it's just built up. Listen, there's a whole talk and conversation around collective trauma.
Right.
Like we're at that point where it's like when the dump has gotten so big, and it's not been cleaned up for so long and now it's leaking out everywhere. Like, welcome to our generation. It's gotten so full.
So we've been holding on to that victim mentality for generations and now it's just leaking out everywhere rather than each person being able to let go of the stuff and then take back.
Yeah, and people were doing the best they could. It hasn't really worked, but all the talking about it, which is good, that did need to happen because we weren't talking about it before. Then we get stuck in the talking about it and now we're just rehearsing it. And then so the coping, people could see like, oh, people are on all these drugs and all these alcohol, they're trying to cope. Let's make a more medicalized version of how to do this, a synthetic way of coping.
Numbing.
It is. It's sort of numbing and glossing over. And so that stuff never gets a chance to fully come out and heal.
Even if it's not being perpetuated, maybe the trauma, it's still being stored, it's still being there, and it's still being held.
Yeah. So now, we've done the victim mentality in ourselves and in our society for so long that even when you learn this, we sometimes continue to be the aggressor and the perpetrator of ourself. So I know when I conceptualized this, victim Victor, and I started to go into it, there were times that I would berate myself, being like, oh, Heather, you're just being a victim right now. And then I'm like, oh, yuck. That's me being really judgy. And like, if I'm in that victim mindset, there's a good reason that I'm there. It's probably resourcing a victimization from my past. I'm not just choosing to be a victim right here. And then I had work to do. I had it was feedback, it was information. And I had to realize that voice of, oh, you're being a victim was me bullying me.
So recognizing that when something comes up and you recognize that it's like, you're pointing the finger at this has happened and this has happened, or Heather, how can you let this, all of those different things are resources and feedback for opportunities to work and process through them from a neutral standpoint rather than a judgmental standpoint.
Yes. And listen, that takes time. It took me time, and I had to sort of go through that and understand and realize and be observant of how much I bullied me. Oftentimes if we're perpetrated against as a child, even by our parents, doing the best that they can, if they were verbally abusive to us or even neglectful in their speech or whatever, we will often parent ourselves in that way. That becomes the voice in which we treat ourselves.
Right, because the voices that we hear become the voices that we continue.
Yeah, and I could completely see how I would I was really passive aggressive with myself, which is a sort of native tongue in my family. And so I would do that to myself quite often. And that was opportunity for growth. I could be victimized like that and say, I'm so mean to myself because my family. And again, that sort of wraps me back in rather than, so here's the victor mindset of that. Oh, well, I have very good reason. I knew really, really well how to speak that language to myself.
Oh, so you're saying that even the victor mindset doesn't necessarily just mean now I've gone from these are all terrible to look how great everything is. The victor mindset even begins with recognizing, oh, good job, Heather, for seeing the resources.
Yeah. Like, oh, look at me caring for me and understanding. So you remember if the drive is to, get that attention, get that, that lack filled up. That's me now doing it for me, is by saying, oh, hey, Heather, like the way that you're speaking to yourself, that comes from something you know. And then you're like, well, I can know something different. Okay, good. How would you want to speak to yourself? And it's this like really nice way that I would love to have spoken to my children when they were little, right? And understand that and have that dialogue and let it be open. Me even doing that puts me in the victor mentality because remember, it's about power. Now I'm shifting from I'm like this because my parents or because my family to, oh, I'm doing this because I know how, because I learned it.
So I can either let things continue to influence me, or I can acknowledge what has influenced me and then be the influencer.
I can change. That makes it all the difference. And even many people in our course community have heard me say this, but I talk about headaches, right? Boy, did I used to do like chronic headaches and migraines and everything like that. So
For very good reason.
for very good reasons. And really one of the subset emotional drivers for that is that you're too in your head. So you're not getting as much communication from the gut and from the heart, which they're really supposed to work all together. And in fact, your head is supposed to be like third on the chain of command on what it gets to think about the input from your gut and your heart. And so I was in my head all the time and so much responsibility and so much pressure and it was being manifested in my head. So I used to take, I think I started at 16 taking migraine medication, but I got off all the meds eventually, but then still sometimes I would do a real nice headache and I would just be like, I'm just going to take some Excedrin. And I would say to myself, okay, right now I'm going to just drop down into the victim mindset here and say, this headache is doing this to me, rather than I'm doing the headache. I'm doing the headache, right? So I would say like, okay, I'm just going to be here and I'm just going to put the power in the Excedrin, that the Excedrin is going to take this headache away, assuming that something outside is making the headache happen.
Which we all do.
Right.
What did I eat? What did I think? What happened to me?
But even the victory of that is by me knowing that I made the choice really still reinforces that I'm the one with the power. So you've heard me say it like, I'm just gonna be a victim for a minute here. And what I'm really saying there is I'm gonna drop down for a second and tell you all the reasons I think that I'm doing this things that's not my fault. And then I'm going to just do that for a minute because I kind of need that witnessed. And then inevitably I go back up because the thing is, because it's mindset is what we practice, we get better at. So that's the set. And so I'm so much more often thinking through the victor mindset that it becomes a little more tough for me to see from a victimized standpoint. So those are just those ways. And I really want to be careful not to be judgy about me choosing, just dropping down into that place. Oftentimes when I'm dropping down, I have a need that's not being met that I need to become aware of and then maybe ask for or do something to meet that need. So even that is communication. So it's been a journey. Didn't happen overnight. It's really been a journey, and it isn't as simple as it may sound. Victor, victim. But it really does help, I think, give us frameworks to kind of think within. Because when people, we've now had so many course students and so many clients, when they really get this, we get emails or phone calls like, oh, I get it. Like they thought they got it in the beginning, but they were kind of still seeing it through a victim
very head
mindset.
Knowledge, right? Of like, oh, I understand that I was a victim and now I need to be a victor and blah, blah, blah. But grasping it up here versus grasping it here is very different.
When they actually start getting the victories that become real, that
when
they
they're
can
doing
now,
the work, right?
Yeah, they can now resource. That's when we get the phone calls and we're like, oh my goodness, I get it.
Yeah.
I'm a victor. Like I'm victorious in this. And so, yeah, it is moving the knowledge from the head into the experience of our mind and body.
And even the experience of having victories over the things, the trauma, the problems, the memories, the negative stuff. When we start to work on ourselves through these methods and starting to see the changes, we're like, oh my goodness, that was a victory. And then you're starting to experience the victories. And then it can actually become who you are. That like, doesn't matter what comes my way, I can do this. Like, it doesn't matter what chaos, what prejudice, what problem, what person, it doesn't matter because I know how to overcome this.
Yes. So if you want to know more about this, we actually go into quite a bit of detail in the Mind Change book under the chapter, Why Am I Such a Mess? And we really, and I give you research articles and people who've written things on this. So if you want to know more about this, just head over, grab the book, or if you've got the book, look at that chapter to kind of read a little bit more. In the show notes, we'll link Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, also the Mind Change book. And there's a lot of great things around this to understand. This isn't to be used as another source of victim shaming. It's really working within the way our brain works,
right.
Our neurobiology. And if we can work with that, with these kind of concepts, then it can really benefit us and the product that we then produce, and it changes our life.
All right. Thanks for the conversation today.
Thank you. All right. Thanks so much again for joining us on the Mind Change podcast. We appreciate you so much. We appreciate you listening, subscribing, commenting, leaving those wonderful 5-star reviews. And we also do this for you. So if you want to give us feedback, let us know what you want us to talk about, what you want us to clarify, then just please give us that feedback and we'll be happy to answer all the questions that we can. And in the meantime, thanks again for joining us as we endeavor to change the world one mind at a time.